was a very, very short time that Beverly was the summer capital of the United States.
One of the early agendas in his presidency was to find a place where he could summer.
Very few people nowadays remember the fact that President Taft lived here for all 4 summers of his presidency. The President of the United States, William Howard Taft, and his family for many years summered in Canada in an area called Mary Bay. And it was thought at that time that it would be inappropriate for the President to be out of the country for any reason.
He had friends who lived in the Beverly area, and he liked the idea, I think, of myopia being over in the back there somewhere, where the handy golf. He wasn't too hot on sailing or being on the water, but there were nice drives around here, the pleasant roads that went around through the back country of Essex County.
You have to think about the period, the fact that in 1909 there was no air conditioning. So it was an area that you wanted to get out of. You wanted to get out of the swamps of Washington.
Boston's North Shore, the Beverly coast area, was really very popular with statesmen from really many different countries. Manchester, they used to call it the Riviera of the Ambassadors or something along those lines.
There was someone who had established the idea that this is a great place to go for the summer from Washington.
Why Beverly? Well, Beverly, you've got cool summer breezes. You have what was known as friendly Republican territory. There were a lot of ambassadors, there were a lot of other politicians that were living in the area. Most of them were Republican for the most part.
The Beverly, Manchester area, Magnolia, even though a tremendous Republican enclave along the coast, so he felt very comfortable there.
Taft arrives for his first summer in Beverly to much hoopla. The press has announced it weeks in advance, and so the local press and also the out-of-town press has arrived in Beverly, and they're waiting patiently at the gates of the Evans estate for the president to arrive.
The first 2 summers he spent at the Stetson Cottage on Woodbury Point. It was owned by a couple named Robert and Maria Antoinette Evans. They had this enormous sprawling cottage down at Woodbury Point, and they had acquired the Stetson Cottage, next door. So Taft and Nellie moved into the Stetson Cottage. It was a 14-room cottage, magnificent building, and so that's where they lived for the first 2 years. Unfortunately, they moved in on the 4th of July in 1909, and 2 days later, Mr. Evans died.
The owner of the estate, Robert Evans, had been surveying his property on horseback, as he would do quite frequently, and the horse stumbled and he took a fall. And at the time, went into the hospital, and they thought it was a minor injury, but it apparently punctured his lung and had some internal bleeding, and ultimately dies a few days later. So poor Mr. Evans is dead. His wife, Maria Antoinette Hunt Evans, is just in a tizzy. She's just lost her husband, and she has house guests for the summer, literally, with the Taft and his entourage arriving on her doorstep a few days after the death of her husband.
It was certainly devastating for Mrs. Evans, a suddenly widowed woman. She was not quite the same after that, just emotionally destroyed. And of course, adding to her angst was this tremendous crush of reporters and Secret Service people and political operatives and gawkers and tourists and souvenir seekers that just overran the edges of the property and in fact onto the property and were not at all shy in many cases about knocking on her door, when they couldn't get anywhere near the president's cottage.
In addition to Nellie, he had his older son, Robert, his daughter, Helen, and his youngest son, Charlie, visiting. Now, Charlie, being a 12-year-old, would get into all sorts of trouble. He would go out rowing, and somehow the oars would fall into the water, and he'd have to be rescued by the launch from one of the presidential yachts. He'd be running around playing hide-and-seek with the Secret Service men, jumping out from behind bushes and scaring the horses, and doing all sorts of things, much to the chagrin of Mrs. Evans. She had the president there for 2 years. He had signed a 2-year lease, and so for the summer of 1909 and the summer of 1910, Taft was there at the Evans estate, which is located on Ober Street.
The first summer, crowds of, long lines of cars going up and down. They were packed all the sightseeing, the cars down along the highway. People walking up the drive and looking for the president, all this kind of thing. Secret Service men lurking in the shrubbery. Particularly, I think the Secret Service men bothered her. But she finally just said, I've had it. There's just too much going on. There's too much, I can't stand it. In fact, she effectively said, I'm getting out of here.
Unfortunately, at the end of the lease, Mrs. Evans decided that she was not going to renew it. And so President Taft, still having 2 years on his term as president, 1911, 1912, needed to find some other accommodations.
What she did was she evicted the President of the United States as a summer lodger, and she told him go find some other place to live. And her excuse was she wanted to tear down the Stetson Cottage and build this lovely Italian garden. And she did exactly that, only she didn't tear the house down. What she actually did was she cut it in half and put it on barges and floated across to Marblehead. And it was sort of like, put back together on Peach's Point, where it became a summer home over there.
Probably the first time in history that anyone evicted a president from a dwelling. But making the most of it, he moved into another location. And the location he found was on 70 Corning Street, also in the Cove, but perhaps a bit inland from the cool breezes that he enjoyed at Lynch Park. And this place was called Parramatta. Now, Parramatta was owned by a widow also, and she really was appreciative of President Taft to the extent that she actually painted the house with a fresh coat of white paint, anticipating his arrival.
The mansion had been built by Henry Peabody, a Salem merchant and seafaring man and explorer of sorts, and Henry had made quite a bit of money, and he had built this mansion like up on a hill in Montserrat called Parramatta, sort of recalling the Parramatta River in New South Wales and Australia, which he had sort of grown fond of in his sort of swashbuckling, rambling days. So Peabody was dead, but his widow painted the house white, and the Tafts were able to move in and spend the next 2 summers there, and were saved at least the embarrassment of having to move to a different town.
The most common way that President Taft would come into town was via train. He had his own presidential train and boxcar.
A private car back in those days was something akin to a corporate jet today. The wealthy had their own jets. They wouldn't travel with the riffraff. They had their own accommodations with their own servants and so forth on board. So it was very insular. It was like taking a part of your little estate with you and traveling with it. The train arriving at Montserrat Depot, and the engine is pulled right up to the Essex Street crossing, and they're on the wrong side. They're actually facing outward on the inbound track, which means that they probably shut down the whole Gloucester branch that day just because of the special move. They called a movement with the president POTUS on the railroad, P-O-T-U-S, President of the United States. So that's how the train symbol was described by the railroad employees. So it looks like that's what they did. They shut down the whole branch. You can see the train stretched out in the background. You can see the Secret Service men in black standing by the side of the train, and various onlookers. So obviously it was a huge deal at the time when the president arrived in Beverly.
They would come into Montserrat, and there was a cutout where the train would pull off onto a siding. And it would sit there, much like a taxi would sit there, waiting to take him to wherever he wanted to go next. And then a car or carriage would come and pick him up and take him from the Montserrat train station to his summer White House, either on Corning Street in the later years or down on Ober Street for the first 2 years that he was here.
I think President Taft understood the value of being up to date, and all of his transportation modes, if you look back at that, I mean, he had his own private railroad car, he had his own yachts, he had his own automobiles.
He was an early automobile enthusiast, and as it's been said, Roosevelt was sort of against the automobile. He viewed it as a symbol of like the upper wealthy privileged class, which he spent a lot of time, trying to dismantle or at least reduce their power and authority. And but Taft was completely opposite. He loved automobiles, and he would go home after playing golf and grab his wife and the chauffeur and maybe Archie Butt and maybe the kids, depending on the day, and they'd be all over the roads, back roads of the North Shore.
People in those days, in the 1912 period, looked on automobiles as something just for the rich. They couldn't afford them. They were $4,000 or $5,000, and the upkeep and the maintenance and the gasoline and all that. And most people had access to streetcars. Streetcars ran all over the place. I mean, you could connect with any city or town in this whole area with streetcars that ran every half hour or so. And so you could just step out of your house and wait for the car to come by and get on, and off you went. You want to go to Salem, Danvers, Peabody, You could go to all these places by streetcar.
Only the very rich had automobiles. It was a major investment. And of course, the owners of the automobiles, for the most part, didn't drive them. They had a chauffeur, mechanic. One of the great activities was Sunday afternoon automobile drives.
And whenever they would leave their driveway, there would of course be the Secret Service vehicle behind them.
And after a few weeks, the locals caught on to this, and it turned into an automobile parade. They would actually publish the number plates of the presidential cars and the Secret Service cars in the newspapers so that the locals could spot them on the highway and know, oh look, there's the Secret Service. William Howard Taft participated in a number of different events, things that you would find typical of any political office holder or dignitary that was in the area.
Well, obviously, if you're President of the United States, you have to be involved in public affairs and public activities. So, he was involved in the GAR parade in Beverly.
One of the ones that was particularly of interest was the GAR parade, which was held in September of 1910. A little later on, he laid the cornerstone for the YMCA building, which was a new building being constructed on Cabot Street.
He went over to Salem in 1912 and dedicated a plaque or a monument to a Civil War unit. He would go to the Republican picnics in the area, and of course, being involved with the Hammonds meant you went to a lot of social functions as well.
Now, we don't think of Big Bill Taft as being a particularly athletic individual, but in fact, he is very athletic. He enjoyed horseback riding. He enjoyed playing tennis. He enjoyed playing golf. He was a member of the Myopia Club, and he played golf there and also at the Essex County Club. The press really loved Taft's adventures on the golf course. They would list the Taft scorecard right under the Red Sox scores for the day. On Sunday mornings, they typically would go to church, and he was a Unitarian, so thus he would go to the First Parish Unitarian Church here in Beverly. The president had his own pew, and the pew actually has a plate on it. And so if you were to go today in the church, you could see the plate on the pew where the president would sit every Sunday. Right off the bat, you've got the locals trying to take advantage of this. You have stationery stores printing little rubber stamps that people would buy that you could stamp the letters sent from Beverly, Massachusetts, summer capital of the United States. What it cost to live in Beverly in 1908 doubled in 1909 because of the president arriving. And the newspapers actually had articles about people complaining about it and price gouging going on because of this. Another thing that happened was that a lot of the farmland suddenly was being divided into house lots, and new streets start springing up during the 4 or 5 years that Taft's here, and that continues on right into about 1920, and you see a tremendous development around the Montserrat area and also around other areas in Beverly, Prospect Hill, during this time period. It meant growth for Beverly. About this same time, the United Shoe comes in 1903. So we have a situation where the workers of the United Shoe are populating the city. People are coming to see President Taft, and they're populating the city. There were a lot of very well-to-do individuals living in the area. And this was something that some of his political allies suggested he not be seen with the likes of Morgan and Frick and some of these other folks that were living in the area. He ignored that because politics was the last thing on his mind. He was there to have a good time.
He entertained a lot and was entertained by a lot of the big names on the North Shore, and some were very controversial. He liked to play poker on occasion with Frick, and he had to sneak in and out of there. J. Pierpont Morgan, they had to kind of sneak him in. And one of the reasons they had to do this sneaking is Taft was stuck in this sort of interesting political and social dilemma in that people like Frick and Morgan and William Moore, people who he had some social interaction with, really represented that class of people that Taft was so politically involved with, trust busting and anti-monopoly. And these were really the enemy, in terms of being a progressive, which he was supposed to be a progressive coming in to carry out Roosevelt's programs. And these people were the enemy in the midst of these people, the stand-patter sort of political faction rather than the progressive.
I think probably one of the persons that gives us the most information about President Taft, and to a certain extent President Roosevelt, is Archie Butt. His name was Archibald Willingham Butt. He was the guy that would line up the ambassadors and line up the other officials at official dinners and things like that to make sure everyone was in the correct order and sitting in the right spot at the dinner table. As a military aide, he was actually the junior aide to both of these presidents. Henry Clay Frick lived very close to Mr. Taft, and he used to spend quite a bit of time with Frick. Archie and he and his secretary snuck away from the Secret Service in the dead of night and snuck over to Mr. Frick's house to engage in a game of poker one evening. Archie is describing the card game. He says, "Here I am playing poker with two of the most powerful men in the world, perhaps one of the most rich men in the world, and also one of the most powerful being the president. And neither of them could play poker very well. Neither of them were very good bluffers when it came to playing cards. And so he and the secretary are winning most of the money." He says, "As we're sitting there, we're surrounded by Turners and Rembrandts, drinking fine wine, smoking a fine cigar, as Caruso is singing on the gramophone and being accompanied by the organist, which is covering up all the nasty scratches that normally would come out of a gramophone recording." And he says, "You know, this is heaven." Archie was also a very sensitive individual. And part of the problem he had was that he had spent 2 years with President Roosevelt. He had spent the 4 years with President Taft. He had an allegiance to Roosevelt. And so when the two men came to verbal blows and parted company, he found that very difficult. And this caused him so much consternation that he actually got physically ill. In 1912, he went to Europe to recover from this nervous situation. And he recovered, and he felt like $1,000,000. Unfortunately, on the way back, he selected the Titanic as a mode of transportation. And anyone that's seen any of the old movies about the Titanic, they know who Major Butt is. There he is, standing with his revolver, preventing any of the men from getting into lifeboats. "Women and children first, or I'll shoot you." Many lives were saved because of his bravery, and he went down with the ship. The most critical visit that happened in Beverly, which ultimately had a great effect on the election of 1912 and other events that would follow, occurred in the summer of 1910 with a visit from Teddy Roosevelt to the President of the United States, William Howard Taft, at the Evans estate. To give you a little background, we have to think about how Taft came into office. Taft